From the coral reefs of the Pacific to the wars in Afghanistan, the scope of National Geographic's photography has left a lasting legacy. And joining us now to take us through more than a century of captivating photography is Reuel Golden. He's the editor with Taschen Books, the publisher of National Geographic around the world in 125 years. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Nice to have you here. I have to say, this is just one volume, and I would lift it up, but I can't. They're very heavy. They're wonderful books. And we're going to try and get through 125 years of National Geographic in 25 minutes.
We'll try.
Okay, let's go. I want to start by, how did you choose the photos for this collection? There are 3 volumes broken up by continent and region. How did you choose them?
Well, I think with a book like this, the challenge is not really what you put in, but also as much as what you leave out. The National Geographic have the richest, biggest archive that I've ever come across. It's around 11 million images. So we really went through the archive quite systematically. It's all organized geographically. So we would pull certain countries or certain regions that we were interested in. So that was one way. The second way that we went through the archive was going through the magazines. And in the space of maybe 2 or 3 months, I went through every issue of the National Geographic ever published. So it was a big, big undertaking.
Every issue. This is a magazine that started back in 1888.
Absolutely, yeah. No, really, you learn so much about the history of the world, the history of the planet, just by looking through the magazines.
So 125 years ago, the National Geographic Society comes together and decides to start this magazine. What are the origins of the magazine? Why did they want to do it?
Part of their mission was really to promote geographic art. And they wanted to learn about land, sea, air, and also about everything within land, sea, and air. But as I said, part of their mission was the promotion of geographic art. Now, when the magazine started, or when the society was founded, photography wasn't a big thing. It was all about maps and it was all about illustrations. But slowly, as photography became more important and the technology improved, as a result, they started using and showcasing photography.
One of the things that I found interesting in going through these books is that we're not talking about, especially in the beginning, typical sort of run-of-the-mill photographers, men with cameras. These were explorers and adventurers and authors.
Absolutely. I mean, you've got to see the early issues of the National Geographic in the context of sort of the Victorian age of discovery, of adventure, of trying to learn about the world. And these, I would say they were scientists really armed with cameras. I mean, I think they were missionaries to a certain extent.
I want you to tell me the story about the guy who went off to Peru back in, I think it was in the early 1900s, and his discovery in Peru.
I think he was just walking along Peru, sort of on a little voyage of...
This is a scientist.
Exactly, a scientist on a little voyage of discovery. And I think he just stumbled upon a little village, and he got into a conversation with a local guy there, and he said, "Is there anything interesting around here to see?" And the guy just showed him there, and lo and behold, he saw one of the wonders of the natural world.
It was Henry Bingham who discovered Machu Picchu.
Yeah,
I mean, literally, a local farmer takes him up there. He stumbles upon Machu Picchu. Amazing.
Yeah. No, it's an incredible story, something that clearly wouldn't happen today.
When you were going through all these images, I mean, was there sort of a tenor sort of tying this all together in terms of how National Geographic photos were and are expected to look?
I think what we wanted to do with this book is we wanted to be true to the spirit of what the National Geographic was about. It was, in a sense, us, Taschen, putting a spin on what the National Geographic represented and what they showed their readers issue after issue, month after month.
And what do you think they were showing their readers in that sort of grand scale?
I think really it's been said many times before, and it's a good phrase, but the National Geographic was like the window to the world. You've got to see the National Geographic in the context. This is pre the internet, pre-Google images. This is how people discovered the world, was really waiting for their copy of the National Geographic to arrive through the mail, and then they would find out about different places, different countries, different cultures.
Okay, I want to bring up some photos and we'll go through them. So this is the first one we're going to bring up. This was shot back in 1916 by Dr. Joseph Dixon. Tell me what we're seeing here.
This is taken somewhere in the Midwest. These are plains tribesmen, and It's got this almost nostalgic element now, because I think as they were known then, the Indian Wars were over by 1890. And I think this is almost an elegy for a lost life, for a lost culture. And it's got a certain poignancy with the people with their back to the camera. It's like you're waving goodbye to that lifestyle.
Okay, something totally different. This is at New York City in 1920, I think this photo is from. Tell us about this one.
This photograph is from Grand Central Terminal, also commonly or wrongly known as Grand Central Station. And what that photograph really shows is it's just beautiful. I mean, National Geographic photographers were real artists. The composition of the picture is amazing. And also it shows a little bit about the alienation of city life. New York at that time was the fastest growing city in the world. It was growing at a rapid rate. It was growing vertically as well. And I think the picture sort of conveys that kind of alienation. So
this is in the 1920s. This is a time when technology is really shifting when it comes to photography, the way that National Geographic approached photography.
Absolutely. I mean, when the National Geographic started, when we saw that early picture of Joseph Dixon, photography was quite a cumbersome. It entailed carrying a lot of equipment.
Give me an example. Someone's going out for National Geographic. What are they pulling with them?
I think, well, they'll be pulling a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, the camera itself was bulky. They'll be taking lenses with them. They'll be taking all kinds of stuff, tripods.
Yeah, lights, all kinds of things.
Lights, absolutely. Yeah. So it's you've got to be fit, not just curious and hungry, but also very fit.
And then we come into the 1920s and technology starts changing. We make the shift into color photography. What did that mean for National Geographic photographers in terms of how the technological changes?
Well, I think color is a very seductive medium, and it's also, in some senses, it's a more realistic medium because we don't see the world in black and white, we see the world in color. So I think the National Geographic photographers could come back from these places and present a more rounded, a more exotic, a more colorful view of the world.
And Kodachrome comes into play.
Absolutely. When people think about National Geographic, they think about Kodachrome. It's just such a lush, beautiful, rich medium for sort of portraying a scene, and it's got that really nostalgia value that people associate with the National Geographic. Kodachrome is something particularly at Taschen that we really love. It's just a wonderful, wonderful sort of film.
I want to talk about the photographers because we keep referring them to National Geographic photographers. I know there are women that shoot for National Geographic today, but back in the early days, it was all men. It was exclusively men. And I know you've been asked this question before, but why was that? Why did we not have women out there shooting?
Well, I think in a sense the National Geographic was reflecting what was happening in the wider society. For whatever reason, there weren't that many women photographers. I think it was perceived to be quite a male profession.
Macho.
You may use that word. I think macho perhaps is appropriate. I mean, there's the image with Robert Capa, classic photojournalist, of quite a sort of hard-drinking, womanizing, sort of a Hemingway type figure. And I think, the National Geographic was reflecting a little bit what was going out there. Also, what we talked about before, physically, it was quite demanding and quite dangerous as well. The photographers were quite exposed in some situations. They were also on their own for weeks and months at a time.
Is there a golden age that National Geographic really had a golden age?
Well, I think we focused on all ages for this book. It's a 125-year journey, odyssey, but I think what I call the golden age is really the age of Kodachrome. So it's probably, I'd say, from the mid-30s to the mid-60s. And I think the golden age is also when the magazine was perhaps at its most influential in terms of readership, and also in terms of the way that inspired people to go and travel. And it also coincides with the post-war period when people had more disposable income, they were buying automobiles. There was this sense of getting in a car, particularly in the United States, and going west and finding out about, you know, the great national parks. So I think there is a golden age, and certainly an aesthetic.
And we should just, you know, mention that, I mean, there wasn't a photographer and then a journalist for National Geographic. The photographers were doing the journalism, they were writing the articles and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, they were multi-skilled. I mean, they were very literary. They weren't just great photographers, they also, many of them were multilingual. They had a good sense how to convey a story, both in pictures but also in words.
Okay, I want to go back to some photos. These are from National Geographic's Golden Age. This is in Lebanon in '57. What do you find interesting about this photo?
This is actually one of my favorite pictures in the book. I know it's hard to pick a favorite picture, but it's as you said, it's taken in Lebanon in 1957. The photographer is a guy called Thomas Abercrombie, who was the quote-unquote the Middle Eastern guy for the National Geographic, and he actually converted to Islam, inspired by his travels. What I particularly like about that photo is it shows the sort of mix of the traditional and the modern, the Muslim and the Christian. It's got everything. It's got amazing life, and Beirut has been called the Paris of the East, and I think that photo explains why.
Okay, something totally different. This is California from the 50s. You actually picked this one. You want to show us this one, and I'm interested in why you picked this one to show us.
I think this photo really represents what we were talking about before, this golden age of the National Geographic. It's also got so much to it. It's got the beautiful American West landscape, the palm trees, the mountains, but also it's got a certain Hollywood glamour to it as well. It's got these people in front of the swimming pool. It looks a little like maybe the photographer intervened a little bit, did a bit of art direction, sort of posed them a little bit. It's just got this rich, evocative feel to it. It almost makes me want to go back in time to the 1950s.
Makes me want to go there.
Totally.
Okay, so that's from the 50s. Let's skip ahead. We're into the 1960s. There's social upheaval. How does that sort of influence the evolution of the magazine at the time?
Well, I think the National Geographic it's never going to be Life or Time magazine. I think the National Geographic...
What do you mean by that?
I think that it didn't really have a strong political agenda. It was always the idea about exploration, about discovery, about caring about the planet. But it was never really setting out to, I suppose, portray people on the margins of existence. It didn't really want to focus, you know, on poverty, on hunger. Not that they didn't want to, I just think that its readers didn't really expect it from the National Geographic. I think that, as I said, they expected it more from Time or from Life magazine or from their daily newspapers. It's
interesting that you say that, because I think if you asked a lot of people, you know, to come up with sort of like what is a National Geographic picture, they would say, you know, a child, a person, whatever, in a foreign land looking very foreign and different from what I know. And I guess that speaks to discovery, but it also speaks to culture and National Geographic's own take on culture and the influence that it had. What kind of cultural influence has the magazine had through the years?
Well, I can speak personally. You know, I grew up in sort of grey suburban London in the 60s and 70s, and for me, you know, the National Geographic, it taught me a lot about America, just looking at the National Geographic, and it sort of inspired me, I suppose, to maybe come to the United States at some point, work and live here. So for me, it was certainly a sort of passage that sort of directed me towards coming to the States. I think people learned a lot about the National Geographic. I think it aroused curiosity. I think it still does. I mean, I've got young daughters, and, you know, they read National Geographic Kids. You know, they learn about animals, about the planet through the magazine. So I think it's still got that sort of educational aspect to it, and I think that's something that was always very important to the magazine. You know, as I said, perhaps that was more its agenda rather than sort of the political side, the political angle.
Okay, back to photos. I want to bring this one up. This is, I think, from 1970s. First of all, just explain what we're looking at there.
Well, I think this is a good example where the agenda the sort of shifted a little bit with the National Geographic. by the late 60s, with the Vietnam War, perhaps people were a little more cynical. Perhaps they were questioning more their values to a certain extent. And also the world had sort of by and large been discovered. There was mass travel. People had basically seen a lot of the places that the National Geographic had covered to a certain extent. So they had to change their angle a little bit. And with this cover, I suppose they're starting to focus more on this idea that our planet is under threat. The issue has to move more towards conservation, not just they're beautiful places in the world. They're also, our world is under threat. And I think that cover certainly was a little bit of a shift change.
Yeah, a duck covered in oil.
Absolutely.
It says a lot.
It says a lot, and I think at the time it shocked a lot of people. It's not what they expected from the National Geographic. But I think, like all great magazines, it had to adapt a little bit, but in a subtle way.
When you picked that one for the book, was it to show the shift in the magazine, or did you pick it solely for its photographic genius, or what? Do you remember why you chose that one?
We actually didn't choose that particular image for the magazine, but for the book. But
that one's not in the book.
No, it's
okay,
not in the book.
There you go. Well, but it is one of the ones that people remember about the National Geographic.
Absolutely, it's something that I think made a big impact with people.
Why didn't you choose it for the book? You had 11 million images to go, and I'm asking you about one.
We had millions of images. I think we felt perhaps now in the context that image has been used many times. But at the time in 1970, it was quite revolutionary. But now, every time there's an environmental disaster, perhaps people were inspired by that image. They run it on their front pages of their newspaper. And I think, we felt that it's been seen before. But it's valid.
Okay. I'm bringing up another one that has been seen all over this world, but it has such a great story behind it. This is, I think, probably accepted as the most famous cover photo taken, I think we know it as Afghan Girl.
Absolutely.
Tell me about when the photographer went and took the photo. Let's go back to then.
Sure, it's the most recognized photograph in the National Geographic history, and it's taken by a photographer called Steve McCurry, a remarkable photographer. I mean, very versatile. But this is certainly not perhaps his most famous portrait. And what's interesting, because I spoke to him about it, is when he originally took this photo, he took it shooting film.
This is in 84.
In 84, exactly. And he was at a refugee camp in Pakistan during the Afghan conflict. And I think when he took it, he had a sense that maybe it's a good picture. But when he saw the film developed, several weeks later, him and I think in his photo editor were pretty astounded. I think they said right away.
Because at this time they're off in Afghanistan, they're sending the film back to
absolutely.
the States to get processed.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking to National Geographic photographers, that was always quite nerve-wracking for them, because they would be at the other end of the world and they wouldn't know whether they got the story until the film was developed. And that was certainly the case with Steve with that photograph. So when they saw it, when the film was developed, they knew right away that's the cover shot. And I think that also photograph represents a little bit what we were talking before with the subtle change in the National Geographic agenda, in a sense that they're focusing on the turmoil, on the hardship, on real victims of war, but they're doing it in a subtle way. It's not explicit. It's not something that is going to sort of horrify their readers, but it tells a very powerful story, and that story is all in that girl's beautiful eyes.
That is not the only cover that woman has been on the National Geographic, because McCurry goes back.
That's right. I think in 2002, after quite extensive research, they finally managed to locate this girl, who is now, of course, a woman. And they
no longer in a refugee camp.
No longer in a refugee, exactly. And her life had improved a little bit, but she wasn't aware of her fame.
She wasn't aware that her photo had ever even been on the cover.
I think she may have been aware of that she'd been on the cover. I don't think she was aware of the impact that this picture made. And certainly her life had improved, but it's an incredible story.
She looks, I mean, you could see it's the exact same person. You see it in those eyes.
Yeah, no,
the
absolutely. No, she's aged, and you can see how the hardship is really reflected in her face. She's aged quite dramatically in some ways, but as you say, her eyes are still piercing, still haunting, and still have that power to draw you in.
Okay, I want to bring up one more photo. We're going back to, this is 65 in Sudan. What are we seeing here?
This is a bit of a strange photo. This is taken, as you said, in Sudan in the 60s. And part of the mission, again, with the National Geographic is they wanted to show different cultures. They had this sort of anthropological aspect to it. And they were always interested in rituals and in costumes and the way people dressed. And what's going on here is it's a sort of rite of passage. And they're sprinkling dust on these young boys to ward off evil spirits.
It's interesting, this photo, and I mean, about sort of that balance that National Geographic and photographers had to do about, showing rituals and very foreign cultures. I mean, what was sort of the approach when they went and photographed cultures? What was sort of the debate that they have? I mean, to show this, was it just like, this is weird and wonderful, let's show it? Or was there a broader discussion about what they were trying to say?
I think you raise a very interesting point. I mean, what the reason why I think the National Geographic could get away with what it did is because, for a start, the stories were so long. So that photo is one of maybe 20 or 30. So the narrative is being built up slowly and quite progressively. So it's not as if the reader is just suddenly seeing one photo. And also, what we were discussing before is the stories and the captions were very informative and very illuminating and very enlightening. So the reader would not just look at these slightly strange things going on, but they would also, combined with the photo and the text, they would learn a lot about what they were seeing.
I'm curious, we are going through 125, we're zipping through 125 years of photography. We do live, I'm not telling you anything new, in an age of Instagram, and everyone's got an iPhone and everyone thinks they're a photographer, and technology has allowed us to be more sophisticated, at least in our photographies as lay people. Is the age of sort of the glory days of being a photojournalist sort of behind us?
Well, I think to a certain extent, I mean, it's quite a difficult question to answer. I mean, I don't think there's ever going to be another magazine like the National Geographic. What we were discussing before, this idea of 60, 80, 100 pages on one story, on one subject, this idea that you can just send a photographer out for several months at a time and they can research and they can just, cover the story in this incredible depth. I don't think we'll ever see that again. But that said, like photography, photojournalism, news photography, it's really a very highly skilled art form. And I think with any art form, there are always going to be people who are simply better at it than anybody else. And those people are going to be there, I think, as long as there's photography. Those people will still be able to show things that people want to see. And also think with the internet as well, that there's in some ways, photographers have changed their medium in terms of where they're showing the photos. A lot of photographers now are combining their stuff with video. They're posting stuff. There's a lot of websites. So there are different channels. There's different media. It's just changing and evolving.
I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you, what is it, as you poured through all these, and I'm sure you thought a lot about this, what is it about this magazine, National Geographic, that has allowed it such staying power? It's 2014, it's still going strong. What is it about this magazine?
Well, I think it's a magazine that people really love, and I think it's a magazine that people always have some kind of emotional connection to. And it's amazing, everybody I talk to has always got a story about how they first came across the magazine through their uncle and aunt or their grandparents. They would keep old copies of the
Sure, I have that. My uncle, the yellow spines on his living room bookshelf. Yeah,
absolutely. They would keep that in their storage, and people, a little like the Encyclopedia Britannica, people would refer back to the National Geographic. So with this book, in a sense, what we've tried to do is take these magazines out of the garages, out of the attics, out of the basement, and sort of brought them into a new light.
Thank you. Superb putting this together, and I know a lot of hard work, so thank you, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.